this presentation, it doesn't focus on roofs, it focuses on water sensitive urban design more broadly, and in fact even broader than water sensitive urban design, the concept of green infrastructure, which is a very broad term, and it is an incorporation of green infrastructure into our urban environments through water sensitive urban design is a way that we can manage some of the complex problems, water related problems that we're facing in our societies today, and particularly in our cities. And the reason being, in the context of climate change and various changes to our water systems, as well as other problems such as growing populations, are making our cities less and less livable. They're becoming warmer through urban heat island effects. They're suffering the same effects of climate change that we're seeing throughout the world. And that's changing our rainfall patterns. And most systems have been designed for many years ago for different rainfall patterns. And so a lot of cities are struggling. And the idea of integrating water sensitive urban design makes so much sense, but it's not without its major challenges, not least of which is the spatial one. There is just no space to put infrastructure into most of our cities. So we end up with more concrete surfaces, more asphalt surfaces, and these exacerbate, they make worse the climate change impacts, and in particular the urban heat island effects. So I've been interested for quite a few years in how to squeeze in water sensitive urban design into our urban environments. And in fact, Rose's own PhD, which was undertaken at UNISA, looked at one technology in water sensitive urban design, that of green walls. And one of the attractiveness of green walls is the condensed footprint that it has, a very small footprint, and you can put it on many walls in our urban cities. But how do you put much larger green infrastructure systems in, like permeable pavements perhaps, or street trees, or bioretention systems? And that's what this presentation is about, is how we can work those into our systems. And one of the major ways is to use what we call multifunctional land use. Just to give you an idea of the problem, there are quite a few trees in Adelaide, but this diagram, this slide here, shows the complexity of planting a single tree in the city of Adelaide. If the council, any council, or even a person operating a piece of land wants to plant a tree and get permission to do so, that flow chart on the left hand side, I'm not going to go through that, but that just shows you all the considerations that have to be undertaken. And on the right hand side, you see all the offsets that you have to allow, from water mains, gas mains, sewers, electrical mains. All of those have to be considered for a single tree. So you imagine trying to plant a bioretention system with a row of trees in it, or even a row of street trees on the side of the tree. These are the challenges and the obstacles that you have to face. So that just gives you an idea of some of the issues that this topic brings on board. But it has been studied extensively. The City of Adelaide recently released a very good document called Creating More Spaces for Trees. And this slide shows their 6 recommendations, which basically is trying to push a top-down approach. So it's saying that legislation is required. So governments have to take responsibility if they want to manage their cities in a more sustainable way. They have to support that with legislation. We also have to develop tools such as decision-making standards. There needs to be further research and development. You wouldn't be surprised to hear that. And then it's about partnering, and you saw in that previous slide how many agencies that you have to deal with, from gas to electricity to water. All of these have to be consulted, so it requires a collaborative decision-making framework, and obviously funding and planning are also key issues. I'm going to show you an example here through construction. This is on our Mawson Lakes campus, and it's a bioretention swale. You can see there that there's a small swale that was pre-existing, and I'm going to show you now how that gets planted out. The car park, what you're looking at is just before a car park is laid. So that's a typical urban environment application. And I'm going to show you how a tree-lined system can be integrated. So there's after the initial juvenile trees are planted, car park was then laid and put in place, and that's it looking today. And these trees in the meantime have grown into quite substantial green infrastructure. There is a corridor connecting those trees, which is a habitat corridor. There's also very great uptake of stormwater through the root system of those trees. Every drop of water, of rainfall that falls on that car park drains into those into that bioretention system and is then utilised by the trees. I'll show you that now. This is the system today. This was taken in 2020, and you can see the trees are very mature now. The way the water gets in is very simple, through cutouts in these curbs. And in fact, that juvenile, not the juvenile trees, but the sedge type vegetation that you saw that was planted in initially has actually been allowed to die off. And the trees are now the dominant species in there. And they are doing all the work in terms of cleansing the stormwater, removing the peak flows and ameliorating the effects that we've created, the negative effects that we've created by hard surfacing this car park and draining water that would have infiltrated before into the soil. So that's the way that's a classic example of how what we call green infrastructure or water sensitive urban design can be utilized to ameliorate an effect that we've had, a negative effect, when we created that car park. So that's a good example of integrating water sensitive urban design into a congested urban environment. And that's the outlet, just to show you that it's an engineered system. It's not just taking the water and draining it into a permeable area and hoping that that will solve the issue. It's highly engineered, highly designed. The soil strata the soil mix in there is very carefully chosen to have a high infiltration capacity, but sufficient nutrient holding to keep those trees well nourished. And it involves some engineering structures such as that overflow pit, which goes out into a receiving water. Another way of doing it, and I'm focusing in this presentation on highly congested urban environments, is to direct water straight into the root system of a tree. And this is called a tree inlet, and TreeNet is a company that produces these. And a diagram of this, it looks like a cylindrical well, which has a porous pipe in the middle, in the center of it, porous just being slotted in this case. And then you can surround that pipe with a media if you're trying to treat the water before it might be polluted water, it might have heavy metals in it, it might have other pollutants in it. So you can select your media from very simple mechanical filtration media like sand or sandy loam, through to highly sophisticated treatment systems such as granulated activated carbon, which you might use to take out certain pollutants. So these systems, again, highly engineered, characteristically a very small footprint, and the tree is literally planted next to one of these systems. That's the actual inlet on the left-hand side, and that which is this part of this diagram. The water then drains into this inner large pipe, slotted pipe, and then exfiltrates into your media, which, as I said, could be sand or granulated activated carbon, and the tree roots absorb the water once it exits that treatment system into the surrounding soil. Again, heavily engineered, but characteristic of small footprint to ameliorate the effect of road runoff. We had a PhD student look at these systems and do some modelling. This is the 6 different scenarios titled S2 to S6, and the base system here, the infiltration system. Sorry, 5 nodes, the 5 nodes, S2 to S6, 5 different models. And these are the different parameters. And the reason I'm showing you this is to lead to this graph here. It shows you what effect you can have just from these systems what effect you can have on the flow reduction. So this is just looking at flow rate, the runoff reduction annually from one of those tree net inlets. And you can see that with a very large system, and S6 was almost the largest system you could put into place, you get up to 25% reduction in flow. So again, it can be used for water quality treatment. It can be used for various other effects, and particularly with trees, as I mentioned, you can have habitat corridors, but it can be used as a flow reduction tool. So a straight hydrologic control, which is equivalent to increasing your permeable area in your catchment. So you're trying to return your highly urbanized environment back to a more natural state, and using engineered systems. The first system I showed you was a biofiltration system with trees in it. The second one was a street tree system with tree inlet pits, and the modeling shows that these can be very effective. So I'm now going to show you the integration of trees again, but this time into permeable pavement systems. I'm sure many of you are familiar with permeable pavements, but just very quickly, permeable pavement is where you use a concrete, typically brick paver, a concrete paver I should say, but you allow water to infiltrate either through the concrete itself using porous concrete, or more commonly between the gaps between the consecutive pavers, which is what these three photographs show in Sydney. So that the water, the incident rainfall or the runoff from the road infiltrates between the paver gaps and down into the underlying base course. And you can see in all these cases there are trees, so that the tree root systems, which are approximately equal to the canopy radius or diameter of the tree itself, is able to access that water once it infiltrates through the pavers. And if you've got a row system like this top left-hand photograph, you can take a lot of water in a very small footprint and recharge either the groundwater or the root systems of these trees. So these trees grow very effectively in these types of instances. Here's a system going into the ground, and you can see that there are impermeable pavers along this footpath. This is in the city of Beecham in Adelaide. And these are the permeable pavers, and you can see the difference is the gaps between the pavers. These are quite a sophisticated type called eco trihex. Quite often they are just straight rectangular pavers with a gap between them. And you can see the pit that the tree is going to go into. The left-hand picture shows a typical street tree in an urban environment, and you can see that the impermeable concrete or asphalt pavement prevents water infiltrating to reach those tree roots. So the trees generally struggle in that environment. Whereas on the right-hand side, if you use a permeable pavement system with a base course, the root systems receive much more water. Is analogous to the tree inlet pit that I showed in a previous slide, except this is done over a much bigger spatial area. And trees live very well, as I showed in the previous slide. Here's another one in Sydney, Macquarie Park in Sydney, and all of these trees that you can see in this slide are receiving water from this permeable pavement system. And these are mature gum trees. And you can see also there's a common misunderstanding that whenever you pave around a tree, those pavers will lift up. I will explain later in this presentation why that doesn't happen with permeable paving. It does with impermeable paving quite frequently. And the reason for that, I might as well explain it here and now. The reason the roots lift pavers generally is that they are hunting out moisture. Roots do that all the time. Trees send out opportunistic fibrous roots to start with, and if they find a moist environment regularly, they'll then either convert or send out much stronger woody roots. And those woody roots are permanent roots, and they're what can lift pavers. That doesn't happen with a permeable pavement system, because what's happening with an impermeable system, asphalt or impermeable pavers, is that the roots are hunting out moisture, and the moisture forms on the underside of an impermeable surface during certain conditions, and that happens regularly. So that's why in a impermeable system, the tree roots will hug the surface, undersurface of the asphalt paving or the impermeable pavers, because there's nearly always moisture there. In a permeable pavement system, the permeability allows both water and air to go either way. So air can go up and water moisture can come up and rainfall can go down. And what that means is the permeable pavement systems dry out very quickly after a rainfall event. So there is no residual moisture that forms, or condensate that forms on the undersurface of those pavers. So if the tree root still sends out its fibrous, opportunistic fibrous roots, they never turn into or get replaced by woody roots that can lift the pavers, because there is no moisture there, and the tree will not sustain a root system in a dry area. So the root architecture forms differently in a permeable pavement system than it does in an impermeable pavement system. And I'll show you some slides in a few moments that demonstrate that. So that's a close-up of that system. I'll show you a few from other parts of the world now, just to show you how these systems are being installed across the world. This is in South Africa, in Durban, North Kensington Drive shopping centre, and there is a system that has both impermeable and permeable pavers. And here is a system where a street tree is hunting out the condensate that I was talking about that's forming underneath this asphalt, this footpath surface. And that's a classic example of where it is successfully finding that condensate and therefore sending out those large woody roots that are quite capable of breaking up that footpath. It's a very common site. Here it is with these are not permeable pavers, they're impermeable pavers, so that condensate again forms, and this large tree has found a very good source of moisture underneath those pavers and has lifted them. That wouldn't happen with a permeable pavement system, as I'll show you in a few. There's another example there, and again there. So these are not permeable pavers, they're impermeable, and the tree roots have no problems in lifting those in order to find the moisture. There's another example. And here is Rose mentioned about ARC grants that we've been fortunate enough to secure. One of those was the longest ARC grant I've ever worked on, actually 5.5 years long, and it involved this row of trees here are an experiment that we designed and installed. So we laid these permeable and impermeable pavers next to each other. There are a whole series of controls in place, and that's when the grant first started, and this was at the end of the grant 5.5 years later. They're still not mature trees, but we planted juveniles, and this is the trees as they are today. And what we did was we forensically investigated how their root architectures formed under asphalt, under impermeable concrete pavers, and under permeable concrete pavers. And there were, by memory, I think 5 repeats for each type and 5 controls, obviously. And we were able to statistically compare the root architectures of those trees. They're all the same species of tree, quite an aggressive tree in terms of the potential damage to pavement systems. And this is what we found. Here is one of the controls. So this is asphalt, and you can see the roots after 5.5 years have broken up the surface of that, successfully finding the moisture. And when you dig this away, which we did at the end of the project, that's the architecture of the root system. Now, bear in mind that is exactly the same tree as this bottom one. The bottom photograph is the same excavation of the same age tree, same type tree, but this time in a permeable pavement system. And this was repeated in all of the systems we dug up. We didn't dig every single tree up because we wanted to keep the project going as a longitudinal study, but we dug up enough to give us statistical evidence that this is what was actually happening. And you can see the architecture is completely different. Bear in mind where that person's feet are is the old surface. So that's the equivalent to this asphalt here, but impermeable paving. And you can see that the roots are not branching out horizontally like they did with the asphalt. They are going deeper. And what they're doing is they're hunting out moisture. They did try to hunt out in exactly the same place originally. They would have sent out fibrous, not strong, very opportunistic roots. They would have not found moisture, and they'd have sent equally ones downwards where they did find moisture, because in a permeable pavement system, the moisture heads vertically downwards. That's how it's designed. And as soon as it got to the bottom of the base course, it then sent out the horizontal ones, because that's the native underlying soil and moisture would have been abundant down there. So you can train a tree root, is basically what this shows you, to follow a given architecture. Now, we applied that in the context of permeable paving, but you could apply it in all sorts of other contexts to, for instance, try and keep roots away from other buried infrastructure, like electricity mains or telecommunication mains or sewers or water supply systems. That will work in exactly the same way. So you can influence the architecture of the tree root system using water sensitive urban design, I guess what this study showed. I'm now going to explain some terminology. I mentioned about impermeable and permeable pavers. The left hand picture shows impermeable pavements. These are very strong. This is a container yard, IMEX in Sydney. And on the right hand side is a permeable pavement system, and I was showing a few photographs of this earlier. Now again, this doesn't have the bedding material yet in the paver gaps, but eventually these will be full of bedding material. So there's no gaps between the the pavers on the left hand side, but there's another important difference, and the reason I put this slide up every time is to illustrate this. These are bedded on different materials. I mentioned bedding gravel for the permeable pavers. If you look in the background to this picture on the left hand side, you'll see sand, and that's what pavers, impermeable pavers, are nearly always laid on. It makes it a very easy surface to compact, and you get very flat, even final surfaces with your pavers, and that's what contractors are used to laying. That leads to a major problem, because there are way more of these that go into the ground than there are permeable pavers. So when you are specifying or designing or installing permeable pavers, one of the common mistakes that's made is the contractors are so used to using sand as the bedding material, they go and use sand as the bedding material for a permeable pavement system. If you lay permeable pavers on sand, they generally fully clog within a year. They simply stop functioning, and that's because the organics that come in with the stormwater and the other sediment, but quite often a large organic load, forms a clogging layer on top of that sand. It can't get through, and that blocks the paver, and the system blocks up. So if you see a clogged pavement and it's permeable pavement and it's not that old, it's worth lifting a few pavers up and just check that it's not been bedded mistakenly on sand, because it's a very, very common mistake. So these systems, I've told you what these ones, the impermeable ones are laid on. The permeable ones are laid on 2 to 6 or 2 to 5 mil gravel, bedding gravel. And I'll show you a photograph of that in the next slide. There we go. So this is a system being laid in Grange in Adelaide. That's the base course material, which in this case is 20 millimeters dolomite, which is a limestone. And this 2 to 6 mil gravel, or 2 to 5 mil gravel, but both specifications are acceptable, is there. It looks just like the aggregate, slightly different color, but it's actually a smaller particle size, quite a significantly smaller particle size. Now, there is an important distinction here from a design perspective between those two gravels that's very, very important to note, and that is the size ratio. If you look at the size ratio between the base course and the bedding gravel, it's less than 10 to 1, which means that's an empirical value that dam engineers use when they're looking to see whether soil can migrate from one area to another. So what that says, because the ratio is less than 10:1, you don't need a geofabric between separating those two layers. And we generally try and avoid geofabrics underneath the bedding material because that can also lead to clogging, a bit like sand does, and also it creates a slipping plane. So you'll notice in that system there's no geofabric, but there's no risk either of that bedding material migrating lower down into the base course. If you were in a country such as the United States or South Africa, both of which use much larger aggregates for their bedding material, for their base course, and in South Africa, 65 mil to 120 mil is sometimes specified. That means that the ratio between the bedding gravel size and the base course is too large for that system to work. And what would happen if you didn't have a geofabric in that case, separating those two layers? The bedding material would wash eventually down into the base course. And in that case, that's why in South Africa and in many parts of the States, they still use geofabrics because they've got those ratios of their aggregate size to deal with. So in Australia, we normally specify 20 mil aggregate for our base course, and that enables us to avoid using geofabrics between those layers. So I just thought I'd make that point. Here is a layer that does show a geofabric, strangely enough. This is a very, very old system, just to show you how those two systems, how a geofabric layer would work for a larger gravel size. Now, don't worry, you're not getting tested on this slide later. I wanted to put this up just to show you the complexity. I don't know if you remember the very first slide I showed was how complex it was. I showed you a flowchart on how to plant a tree. This is a much worse flowchart, and this is the design flowchart for a paver. It's not even a permeable paver. This is a design flowchart to lay an impermeable paver onto effectively sand. And you can see how complex that is. And that is why very rarely do we do hand calculations for either permeable or even impermeable interlocking concrete pavers. We have to use software, and all of this gets computerized to the touch of a button in software that's just been produced by the University of South Australia, sponsored by the Concrete Masonry Association of Australia, CMAA, and available free of charge through the CMAA website. So if you just type in cmaa.com.au, there is a quick link to download this software. A word of warning for using it in Malaysia: the software has two elements. You can see it in this screenshot on the right hand side: design pave and perm pave. The design pave would work in Malaysia, in Kuching or elsewhere, and that part of the program can be used to design free of charge either permeable or effectively impermeable paving systems. It will design the structural side of the permeable pavement system, but you can see this perm pave element on the right hand side that has hardwired into it Australian rainfall data. So that wouldn't work for rainfall conditions in Kuching. It doesn't stop you using the program. It just means that the only useful part to you, if you're using that program to design a Malaysian system, is you'd basically be able to undertake the geotechnical or structural design of the paving system. Then you'd have to do a hand calculation or use other software to do the permeable paving, the hydrologic calculations. Because as I said, the software is hardwired for Australian rainfall conditions. So that design pave software, I'd encourage you to have a look at it. It is the most sophisticated software package available today. It does very heavy, it's got the British Ports method built into it, so it does extremely heavy duty pavements. You can design pavements for airports, for container terminals, and I'll show you some heavy applications later. So that software was literally released last year. It's the newest software available in the world and also the most sophisticated. And it involves a very complex mechanistic design. Now I'll show you some projects that have been designed using that software. King William Road, Rose might remember, in Adelaide, is Australia's longest paved road anywhere in Australia. It's 3,000 square metres of interlocking pavers, and I'll take you through the construction. I'll take you through the history of it actually and the construction in just a moment. So that's a road application. I'll then look at Leppington Bus Depot is a bus depot that's been put in Sydney only a year or two ago. And this has both interlocking and permeable paving. It has quite heavy loads. It's obviously bus parking and bus movements on there. But it's also part of the new Sydney airport. So it has very heavy traffic, passenger traffic. And then finally, the heaviest application in Australia to date is the import-export terminal in Sydney, the Moorebank, what we call IMEX, which stands for import-export. And this has container yards that basically take containers off ships with cranes, and those crane loads are straight down onto these pavers, which shows you that's about the heaviest application. That's a heavier application even than an airport. And that's a very large site as well, 20,000 square metres. So all these were undertaken in the last 3 or 4 years. The King William Road one, however, was a replacement project. Those other two were new projects that were built from scratch, greenfield sites effectively, whereas King William Road has always been paved. Well, since the 1980s it's been paved, and this is the repaving that occurred about 2.5, 3 years ago. So I'll start with that one. That's the original road being constructed in the 1980s, as you can tell by that car. And there's a picture of the sand going down, and that's the bedding sand, and the pavers were then laid on top. And that was the road as it was constructed in 1985 with impermeable pavers. And as I said, the largest road area in Australia with a paved surface. And it's quite beautiful, was quite beautiful. That was built in pretty sure it was 85. Yeah, 1985. And was built for a design life of 25 years, but it was only replaced a couple of years ago, 2.5 years ago. So it actually lasted over 35 years. Really, to be honest, it could have kept going, but the decision was made to relay it. So I'm using that as an illustration to show you how robust these systems are. Sometimes people have the impression that paved systems are less strong than asphalt or concrete systems. It's simply not true. Basically, a paved system and what we call an interlocking paved system is a very good way of sharing load. And the pavers themselves don't actually take the brunt of the structural forces. That is shared to the base course, and the base course is solid stone, and that can take enormous loads, as I said, containing loads, as I'll be showing you later. So these systems are inherently strong and inherently long lasting, and that's the same road today after the new pavers have been put down, and that system will last another 35 years now. So that's that project. That's what it looks like today. And you can see this time we have also had some street trees, but these are not being drained, not receiving runoff from those pavers because these pavers are impermeable. Now I'm going to show you Leppington Bus Depot, which is one of the first suburbs in what's called the southwest growth area of Sydney, and that's being serviced with a new airport, a second Sydney airport. The project consisted of 2,000 square metres of building facilities, 7,000 square metres of impermeable concrete segmental paving, and 2 500-metre square areas of permeable concrete segmental pits. And under those were created underground tanks using the base course material. I won't go into that in this presentation, but there is a separate technology that was developed at the University of South Australia, which incorporates storage underneath permeable paving systems, and that's what these 2 500 square metre areas were. And that created those collected all of the runoff from the entire 10,000 square metre site, and that was diverted into those 2 permeable pavement pits, and these allowed the designers to maximise the total pavement hard stand area for the bus company, and by using permeable pavement systems they were able to reduce the site discharge to below the council threshold, which in Australia is 88 litres per second for a 5-year design storm, and 165 litres per second for a 100-year design storm. Those values will be much larger, I think, in Kuching, where you get much more significant full bursts, heavier rainfall intensities. But Sydney gets one of the highest rainfall intensities, design intensities, of all Australia's capital cities. So those are quite strict limits, and that site was able to be constructed, and that really was the biggest cost saving from the system. The biggest cost in most large paved area systems is very rarely the actual pavers themselves or even the surface material. It's usually the drainage pits and pipes, which are buried infrastructure that brings a cost associated with it, but they're also expensive infrastructure to lay. So the benefits of using permeable pavement systems is it's offsetting those expensive pits and pipes which are not required for a permeable pavement system. I'm also going to show you this system being laid because it is quite amazing. Rose, sing out if this doesn't work or doesn't stop. I'm going to run a video that lasts about 2 minutes now, and it shows this Leppington bus depot being constructed with both permeable and impermeable pavers. Last project is of the 3 projects I'm using to illustrate this is the Moorbank IMEX. That's largely impermeable, but very, very heavy duty, and that's why impermeable is probably a better option for this particular site. So you can see that being laid on sand, not on gravel. That video, when you look at the video when you get a chance, showed pavers the impermeable pavers being laid on sand, and the permeable pavers being laid on bedding gravel. And there's a very important distinction between those. These 2 pictures here show the 20,000 square meters of interlocking concrete block pavements that aren't permeable being laid at Port Botany in Sydney, which is where the ships come in, the freight ships. And I've only got the construction photographs. I haven't got a picture of the cranes, but they can stack the containers on those pavers, sometimes 4 containers high. They rarely go above 4 containers high, but that's an enormous, not just a load on where the container is. The containers are typical shipping containers, or what you see on the back of articulated lorries, trucks. But more importantly is the corner load. If you've got any eccentricity as they're being lowered by crane, the first corner that impacts on the pavers takes the whole weight of the container as a point load at that corner. So they have to be designed to take that enormous load. So it's an illustration of how heavy duty you can design these systems firstly, but secondly, you can understand, because it's such a big geotechnical problem, issue in terms of soil movement, in terms of sharing that load over a sufficient area. It's very complex to design, and that's why I was saying before, if you use the design pave program, the design pave program designed this system using the British ports method, which is the heaviest duty, safest, most conservative design method for heavy duty industrial pavements. And that would work in Malaysia, in Kuching, just as well as it works in Sydney, because it's around soil characteristics, paver characteristics. It's not around hydrology. Obviously, Malaysia's hydrology is very different to Australia's hydrology. Okay, so I'd encourage you to look at that software. I mentioned the pavement reuse concept. This was developed at the University of South Australia soon after I joined UNISA in 2006, and in fact this system was put into the ground in 2007. Still functions today. It's on our Mawson Lakes campus, and here's the concept diagram. I mentioned tanks when I talked about the IMEX system, and you'll see that in the video. They're not strictly tanks. They're permeable pavement systems that are lined. And I'll take you through the construction of this. I think I've got that in. Yes, I've got it in the next slide. So this is and we built this as a concept demonstration. The whole concept was developed for the first time at the University of South Australia, and it's been used across the world since then. We give away the designs of this free of charge. We don't charge the intellectual property of this. We just want more of these systems to go in the ground. They are incredibly cheap, much, much cheaper than any structural tank you can ever put in the ground. And more importantly, they're a good illustration of multifunctional land use. And the reason being, what you're looking at in that top photograph is a standard Australian car space, which a design specification of which is quite simple, 5 meters by 3 meters. That is a car space that you can park a car on. You can park something much heavier than a car on it, but it is a car space, a functional car space. The integrating water-sensitive urban design into congested urban environments is best illustrated with this device, because it's not just a car space, it's also a rainwater tank, and it can hold 4,000 litres of rainwater. And how it does that is very inexpensive and very efficient. What happens is the water infiltrates through the pavers. If you look at that bottom diagram, it infiltrates through the pavers, through the bedding course, and into the base course. Normally, it would then infiltrate further into the subgrade, the native soil effectively. But what we've got in this concept is an impermeable lining. In this particular case, this was a 1 millimeter thick, and it only has to be 1 millimeter thick, high density polyethylene liner, and I'll show you a photograph of that being dropped into the ground a bit later. We've since modified the design to get an even lighter material in, because there is a 0.75 millimeter thick polypropylene lining that's even better to use. It's less heavy, it's more malleable, it can be shaped to the hole much more easily, and it's just as tear resistant. So even construction equipment will not tear that liner. So it's impermeable for life. And it's like a swimming pool liner effectively, and it comes delivered to the site welded to the shape of the hole. So you specify the hole dimension, and then the manufacturer drops you one of these impermeable liners, exactly that hole shape, and then it just drops into that hole, and I'll show you that in a second. And then the water is returned, so the water is stored in the base course. That's the only physical tank. The reason you don't need a physical structural tank is there's no forces trying to move that water in any way. It's surrounded by native soil, and the native soil is sufficient to hold the shape of that water. And then, so all the impermeable lining is doing is stopping the water from exiting. So the water builds up in this permeable pavement system, and it is retrieved in this case with a small solar pump, and I'll talk about the solar pump in the next slide. That went into the ground. Bear this in mind, that was built in 2007, and to prove the concept, I'll take you through the construction of it. We built an identically sized system next to it, and I'll explain that in just a second, but that wasn't a permeable pavement system. let's just go through the construction first. So these are Australian dollar costs, just to give you an idea. That pit was dug and it cost of $500, including the delivery of the excavator to site. If you were building 10 of these in a row of houses, it would be far cheaper than $500 per hole. About 450 of those $500 was the delivery of the system to site. The hole was dug in less than half an hour. There's the impermeable lining, which is dropped in, and then the bedding gravel, sorry, not bedding gravel, the base course gravel is what this photograph is showing, which is that 20 mil aggregate. If you use limestone, the cost is $260. If you use granite, it's $700. That's the range, the minimum and maximum range of costs for your bedding material, sorry, for your base course material. And quite frankly, the limestone is sufficient. So $260 is what that would cost you, and that's what this one cost. The lining cost $400 for that size, 5 meters by 3 meters by just under 1 meter. And sorry, I'll just go back. You can see that slotted pipe. That is where your solar pump, submersible pump, sits. It sits inside that pipe at the bottom, and the water comes in through those slots and is filtered and cleaned by that gravel, and the water is retrieved. What would you retrieve it for? I'll now show you that other application. I'll just quickly show you the finished system. The total material costs were $2,200 Australian dollars per car space back in 2007, so it would have changed since then. But what we did to prove the concept was to try and create a totally sustainable system. So about 3 years later, about 2010, we built a rainwater garden next to it. And I'll show you the photographs of this, but this is the concept. So the rainwater pump that I showed you is that black triangle. There's a small solar panel about the size of a laptop computer, which generates that pump. So there's no electricity to this site, and there is no water to this site. So that rainwater garden, to be sustained, must draw all the water it ever needs from that permeable pavement system. If that permeable pavement system cannot provide enough water over a typical year, or even over a season, that rainwater garden will die, and would have died, and it has never died. And I'll show you the diagrams in just a second. So the irrigation is totally automated. No one goes and withdraws water and then waters the garden. The small submersible pump is controlled by 2 soil moisture sensors, those red circles, which are wired back and trigger the pump to switch on. And then the pump irrigates via this standard 12mm irrigation system, pipe system, which covers the entire area of that bioretention system, rainwater garden. Okay, so that's what it looked like straight after we planted around 2010. You can see these different plant species. You can't really tell, but there are 3 different plant species part there. You can see there's a grid shape with string. That's because it was an experimental design with controls and repeats again, which we use for other purposes. The 2 soil moisture sensors are shown where those 2 pipes are, and other than that, it's a standard rainwater garden. You can see that irrigation pipe coming along there, and then there's a buried irrigation system underneath the thing. There's the submersible pump, which goes into that hole there. You can see the irrigation pipe there. That's the slotted hole in the permeable paving system. And sorry, I've misled you. I'm just going back. Those aren't the soil moisture sensors. It's just there is a soil moisture sensor in that corner. Those are water sampling pipes where we can retrieve water to test the quality. So the soil moisture sample, there's one close to that back pipe and there's one in this corner here. So those pipes are for different reasons. Just going back again. So that's the solar pump. You can't see it, but the panels on behind that sign, you can see the electronics just coming around, but that's about the size of the solar panel that provides electricity to this site. There is no other mains electricity, and that's what the system looks like today. What's that, 11 years after it was planted. Now, we have had some plants die off and others have taken over. You can see it looks a pretty ugly system, quite frankly. And that's because we've just let nature take its course. We've not manicured that in any way. We just wanted to see whether the system could sustain itself indefinitely. And to this date, it has done so. So that garden, those plants that you're looking at, have never, not once, been manually watered. They've only ever been watered automatically from that permeable paving system. And that permeable paving system has equally never run dry for long enough to kill those plants. So that system is totally sustainable, very small footprint, multifunctional, because you can park your car. So that rainwater garden will be next to a driveway or next to a car space in a car park, and you can replicate and scale up across entire cityscapes. And bear in mind, that's in Adelaide, and Adelaide is Australia's driest capital city. We get the lowest rainfall of any of the 5 capital cities in Australia is Adelaide. And the longest inter-event dry periods are also in Adelaide in summer. And yet that system has survived 11 summers consecutively. I'm going to point now to a very important study, and because one of the other objections we get with permeable paving is, are they more expensive? Is this a technology that's high cost? And the answer is no. And the best evidence of that is this study, which was a UK study undertaken for Interpave, which is the equivalent to CMAA in the UK. Interpave produced their own software, by the way. And this study was very, very well done. It took 250 projects, paving projects across the UK. And the UK has way more permeable paving systems than Australia has. It's a real pioneer, not such a pioneer, it's pioneered in Germany and Austria, but it's certainly one of the biggest adopters. This UK study took 250 UK projects and then redesigned them. So if they were permeable paving projects, they redesigned them for asphalt. If they were asphalt projects, they redesigned them for permeable paving. And then they did a third one, which was impermeable paving as well. So they designed them 3 times, every single project. And then did a whole of life cost for all 250 to get a spread of projects of different scales and to see statistically whether there is any evidence of differences in cost and what they were over the whole of life of projects, of actual projects that are in the ground, 250 projects that have actually been built that you have existing costs for. They know those well-documented costs, and then they redesigned them and estimated what the costs were for the 2 different designs they did. And now I'm going to show you, this is available on the web. If you go to the Interpave website, you can download this report. It's a huge report because it describes 250 projects, but you can download this free of charge. And I would recommend it. It's very compelling evidence of what systems actually cost, not what people perceive the cost to be, what the actual costs are. Okay, and this is the finding. WLC is whole of life costs. And this is really interesting when you look at this. The left-hand 2 graphs are concrete block paving and asphalt. I've taken the third one out just for simplicity purposes. Okay, so concrete block paving has higher initial costs, which we know about that. And that's the cost, that's where that perception comes from. It comes from this idea that they are, probably looking at that 15% more expensive than an asphalt paving system to put into the ground. Then, if you look at the whole of life costs with a discount rate of 5%, 10% and 15%, which are typically you'd use 7 to 10% in most construction projects. Probably 7 is probably an average. So you very rarely go to 15% and you'd very rarely go as low as 5%. But it will be at that lower end. Typically 7% will be very commonly used discount rates. The only one where asphalt came out statistically for 250 projects, the only one where it was cheaper over the whole of life cost was if you went to a discount rate of 15%. Now, if you use 10 or 5, and typically you'll be somewhere in between those two, permeable paving systems come out cheaper And if you're around the 7% mark, which is closer to 5 than 10, they're substantially cheaper. And that's over 250 existing projects. So I would recommend you to go and look that study up. Very comprehensive, very well done, and very compelling evidence about the actual costs of paving projects. I'm going to now talk about the environmental performance of these systems. And another concept that we've developed at the University of South Australia is an offset system where we can plant sufficient trees to offset the embedded carbon in a permeable paving system. And so I'll just run through this very quickly. This is looking at ameliorating heat island effects largely, because those trees form a very good way of ameliorating heat. The pavement types, this is a study undertaken in Japan, and this just illustrates the maximum surface temperature. So this is sensible heat effectively of paving and asphalt in midsummer in Japan. And the differences are asphalt gets to 58 degrees centigrade, whereas in the same environment, paving gets to 40 degrees. The difference in that is purely about the albedo. Albedo is the solar reflection, and asphalt generally is black. It has the worst albedo, the highest albedo. Typically an albedo of about 1. And that means that all of the heat is basically reflected. And it's not all reflected, but it has a reflectivity of effectively 1. It still heats up itself, but it also carries on radiating outwards even at night time, and that's why you get worse urban heat island effects from asphalt than you do from any other construction material. Concrete is much better. It's not great, it's not as good as grass or any type of vegetation, but it brings it down to about 0.25 to 0.3 for an albedo, because it's a light grey typically, and other than that it still gets quite hot, 40 degrees. This, though, is a sensible heat flux measurement undertaken both at daytime and nighttime with an asphalt paver, is the middle one. Sorry, asphalt surface, I should say. PICP is permeable interlocking concrete paving. That's the 2 graphs on the left-hand side. And then porous asphalt on the right-hand side. So you see porous asphalt is no better than asphalt. And what this is the sensible heat flux during the day and then at night. And what I'd ask you to think about when you look at these graphs is basically a 3-to-1 ratio. If you look at this left-hand one, which is the permeable interlocking concrete pavers, if you take either the blue graph, I'm colourblind here, so I have to assume it's either green or brown. That second one, it might even be orange. But if you look at that, it doesn't matter whether you take the blue or the green or the orange or whatever, if you times them by 3, that's what you get in the other 2 graphs. So 160 times 3 is roughly 450 to 500. 40 times 3 is exactly 120. So what that tells you is that you get 3 times the heat radiating back out of an asphalt paver, or asphalt surface rather, than you do out of a permeable pavement system. That doesn't matter whether it's daytime, the blue, or nighttime, whatever colour that is. So during the day, it radiates out about 1/3 of what the equivalent asphalt surface would, and at night, it's exactly 1/3. So that is very compelling evidence again that you've got a more sustainable, more climate resilient system if you use permeable pavers. Now, what about the carbon neutrality? This is what I was talking about for offsetting. We a study that showed, and this varies with plant species, with tree species, and many other effects, but the study we published demonstrated that a tree can capture about 20 kilograms of carbon dioxide per annum, or 1 ton over a 50-year lifespan. When we first did this study about 10 years ago, since we first did that study, we've since repeated it for different plant species, and just to see what the variation is, and it turns out the variation is huge. You can get, that's a very conservative low-end figure of 20 kilograms and 1 ton per 50 years. There are tree species that you can plant that would absorb way more carbon dioxide than that and convert it into tree mass, effectively into carbon through photosynthesis. Now, I don't want to mislead you here, because there are two types of carbon that the literature follows effectively when you look at carbon capture. There is what you call effectively superficial carbon, carbon that stays on the surface of the planet and gets recycled time and time again. And a tree would be an example of that. So even though it's locking up the carbon dioxide into carbon, that's a great thing, but it's not a permanent locking up. That tree may one day get burnt, it may biodegrade after it dies, and effectively it will release its carbon again through the system. That carbon might get consumed and locked up by other organisms. There's a very high chance of that. But if it was burnt, then it would definitely, through a forest fire or through other natural occurrences or unnatural ones, if it was used for fuel, for example, then the carbon dioxide returns to the atmosphere. So it's not permanent. And so to distinguish between those, the literature looks at what's called deep carbon. Against superficial carbon, effectively. Superficial, there's many names you can use for it, but deep carbon is the common name. This isn't a technology for deep carbon storage. Deep carbon storage is where it gets locked up into the rock masses within the Earth's core, effectively. Well, not core, but below the Earth's surface. And that's much more permanent, much better way of storing carbon, because it never gets, well, hardly ever gets released back again. So that will be the ultimate goal of humankind in decades to come. We've got such a long journey to go on that, because we're still releasing way too much carbon dioxide, let alone trying to lock it up. We're doing a terrible job for the planet. So anything we can do sufficiently is still better than doing nothing at all. Okay, so I just wanted to distinguish between deep carbon and what we're looking at here. But in our study, we showed that if you planted a tree every 11 square meters, in a permeable pavement system, and you remember those pictures I've shown you, they were much closer than 11 square meters, that would offset the carbon neutrality. It will create a carbon neutral paving system. And that's a conservative estimate, because many tree species can be selected that would store a lot more than 20 kilograms of carbon per year. So that's a low end estimate. And so this technology that I started the presentation with has a very many benefits other than just controlling water. It can be used as a climate tool effectively. It can be used to ameliorate heat island effects. It can be used to move tree root systems away from buried infrastructure. It can be used to create habitat connectivity. It can be used for water quality control. The uses are almost endless. The benefits, I should say, are nearly always endless. So I'll finish this presentation by saying that our traditional approaches to water resources management, which is basically using pits and pipes and getting rid of water as quickly as possible from a site, actually present major constraints to new development. So they're not only unsustainable, they're actually going to stop us doing things in the future. So there is a time and a need to change that approach. And we've been changing that approach. Many countries, including Malaysia, have been looking at water sensitive urban design. What I've tried to illustrate in this presentation is the next generation, how water sensitive urban design can be integrated into highly congested urban environments and still create these many benefits which I've mentioned in this presentation. However, I will finish with that final dot point, which is the impediments. LGA is local government authority, and CSP is concrete segmental paver, and PICP is permeable interlocking concrete pavers. So basically, unless there's a top-down approach, unless governments support this, it's very difficult to get major wins and to major successes from a bottom-up approach. A good example of a bottom-up approach would be your humid tropics centre in Kuala Lumpur, where they demonstrated water sensitive urban design, which would have been at least 20 years ago. A dear friend of mine, Mohammed Nordessa, was involved in that project. He's sadly passed away since then. And I think it's still in the ground today. And I know Rose and others are carrying the baton for water sensitive urban design in their research, and I wish you all the very best for that. And we would be, University of South Australia would be very happy to collaborate with you. moving forward. So I'll finish there.